William sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the only sound coming from the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound had never bothered him before, but now, in the silence of his home, it felt deafening, like a relentless reminder of time slipping away. At 72, William had everything a man could ask for: a successful career behind him, a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, and children who had built their own families. Yet in this very moment, he felt an overwhelming emptiness. It wasn't always like this. Just a few years ago, his days were filled with purpose. He had been a man in control, respected, always busy, always needed. Then, retirement came like an unexpected storm. First, the emails slowed down. Then the phone calls stopped. People who once relied on him had moved on. And just like that, the man who had spent decades making decisions that impacted hundreds of people was now standing in a grocery store, unsure of what kind of bread to buy. But the worst part? The loneliness. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. It had been swift, merciless. One day she was there, laughing at his terrible jokes. The next, she was gone, leaving only a lingering scent of her favorite lavender perfume on her side of the bed. His children, though, loving, had their own lives to manage. They visited when they could, but the spaces between their visits stretched longer and longer. There was a moment, just last week, when William had caught his own reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him. Rekti. Sharp, ambitious eyes of his younger years had dulled into something else, something lost. He wasn't just aging, he was disappearing. One evening he found himself doing something he had never imagined. He sat at the kitchen table, a bottle of scotch in front of him, and entertained a thought that sent a chill down his spine. What if I just stopped trying? What if he simply allowed himself to fade into the background, unnoticed, unneeded? The idea terrified him, but it also felt inevitable. Was this how the rest of his life would be? A slow, quiet descent into nothingness. And then something unexpected happened. A phone call. A familiar voice from the past. Eleanor. They hadn't spoken in years, but her voice was just as steady, just as warm. "William," she said after a long pause, "I was thinking about you. How are you, really?" For a moment he wanted to lie, to say he was fine, to keep up the illusion of control. But something in her tone, gentle, knowing, made him tell the truth. And that night, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. Eleanor listened. And then she spoke words that would change everything. "What if I told you that this isn't the end, William? That there's another way to live? One that's not about clinging to what was, but embracing what is?" That question stayed with him long after the call ended. It stirred something inside him, something restless, something waiting. Could she be right? Was there another way to live? Had he spent so much time mourning the past that he had forgotten how to live in the present? He didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in a long time he wanted to find out. Letting go and embracing impermanence. William's journey of healing. The afternoon sun filtered through the old oak trees, casting shifting patterns of gold and shadow on the worn wooden bridge. William stood at the edge, watching the river move in slow, deliberate currents beneath him. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes whispered in the breeze. He exhaled deeply, the weight in his chest pressing against him like an invisible hand. Eleanor stood beside him, silent for a moment before reaching into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a dried maple leaf, crisp and delicate in her fingers, its veins etched like a fragile road map of time. She extended it toward him. "Take it." He hesitated before accepting the leaf. It felt impossibly light, yet somehow holding. Yet he felt the heaviness return, the weight of all the years, of all the things he had clung to without realizing. Eleanor motioned toward the water. "Let it go." He furrowed his brow. "And then what?" She smiled softly. "Watch." William turned the leaf over in his palm. It was absurd, really. A leaf wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring back the past or undo the years that had slipped through his fingers like sand. But still, something about the way Eleanor stood there, waiting, made him pause. Slowly, he extended his hand over the railing and released it. The leaf hesitated, in the air for the briefest moment before surrendering, twisting and turning as it descended. It landed on the water's surface with barely a ripple. He watched as it rocked gently, caught the current and drifted away. Something deep inside him stirred. For years, he had carried the past, like a stone in his chest. He had relived the same memories, the same regrets, as if holding on to them could somehow bring them back. The night Margaret had been rushed to the hospital, the way he had gripped her hand, as if sheer willpower could keep her there. The moment he realized that no amount of love, no amount of begging could stop what was coming, the way the house had felt after she was gone, hollow, like a bell that had been struck but never allowed to ring. He had held on to all of it. And, yet standing here now, watching a single leaf disappear down the river, he wondered if he had been holding on to a ghost. Eleanor must have sensed the shift in him because she spoke again, her voice gentle. "Impermanence isn't loss, William, it's just life. Things change, people leave, time moves forward, but that doesn't mean what we had disappears. It just takes a different form." He swallowed hard. "I don't know how to move forward. You don't have to, you just have to stop holding yourself back." They stood there in silence for a long time, the sounds of the river filling the spaces between them. That night, for the first time in years, William dreamed of Margaret. But it wasn't the hospital. It wasn't the quiet, empty house. It was them young again, sitting on their front porch in the golden light of a summer evening. She was laughing, carefree, radiant. And in the dream, instead of reaching for her, instead of trying to hold on to something slipping away, he simply sat beside her, listening, letting the moment be what it was. When he woke, the ache was still there. But it was different now, softer, less like a wound, more like a familiar presence. Over the following weeks, he found himself returning to the river, sometimes alone, sometimes with Eleanor. He brought leaves with him, small ones, large ones, curled and broken ones. With each one he let go of something different. The regret of missing his son's graduation because of a business trip, the guilt of not saying "I love you" enough when Margaret was alive, the fear that he had become invisible, a relic of a life long gone. One afternoon, as he was about to toss another leaf into the water, a monk in simple saffron robes approached. He was old, but his movements were steady, deliberate. He watched William for a moment before speaking. "What do you see when you look at the river?" William thought for a moment before answering. "Movement." The monk nodded. "And yet if you returned tomorrow, would it be the same river?" William frowned. "No, the water keeps flowing. And so does life." The monk bent down and picked up a small stone, pressing it into William's palm. "Hold this." William curled his fingers around the rock. It was smooth, solid, heavier than he expected. The monk gestured toward the water. "Now imagine carrying that every day, every moment. Would you not grow tired?" William didn't need to answer. He understood. The monk smiled. "Letting go isn't forgetting. It's making space." William looked at the rock, then at the river, and then, without hesitation, he let it fall. It sank without a sound, disappearing beneath the surface. A strange sense of lightness settled over him. That evening, as he sat on his porch, he watched the autumn wind carry the last of the golden leaves from the trees. He thought about how, just a few weeks ago, he would have mourned their passing, seen them as another reminder of time slipping away. But now, he saw something different. Not an ending, just a change, living with compassion, finding joy in giving. The wind carried the scent of autumn, crisp and earthy, as William walked through the park, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn wool coat. The leaves beneath his feet crunched softly, scattered like remnants of something once whole, now surrendered to the season. He had never paid much attention to the sound before. Strange, how loss had a way of sharpening the senses, making him notice things he had once walked past without a second thought. Ahead of him, a man sat slumped on a wooden bench, shoulders hunched against the cold. His coat was thin, frayed at the edges, barely enough for the biting wind. A battered duffel bag lay at his feet, the kind of bag that held everything a person owned when there was nowhere left to go. The man rubbed his hands together, his breath curling in the air like fragile threads of smoke. William hesitated. He had seen countless men like this before, on street corners, outside grocery stores, in alleys where people chose not to look. He had always walked past, telling himself the same thing everyone did. I can't fix this. Someone else will help. But today something in him resisted that instinct to keep moving. He stepped forward, slow and unsure, and sat at the other end of the bench. The man didn't acknowledge him, eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point. William hesitated, then, without a word, pulled off his gloves and held them out. The man glanced at them, then at William. His hands, cracked and reddened from the cold, hovered in the air between them, as if unsure whether to accept or retreat. "They're warm," William said quietly. "Take them." A pause. Then, slowly, the man reached out and took the gloves, sliding them over his fingers. He flexed his hands, testing the feel of them, before looking up. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough, unused. William only nodded. They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind chase the leaves across the pavement. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic shift in the universe. But something inside William felt different, lighter, as if a thread that had been wound too tightly had finally loosened. That night, he stood at his kitchen counter, staring at his hands. They felt strangely bare without the gloves. But the absence didn't bother him. Instead, he thought about the way the man had looked at him, not with pity, not with shame, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if, for the first time in a long time, he had been seen. William thought of Margaret. She had always believed in the power of small kindnesses, the kind that didn't ask for recognition, the kind that didn't demand gratitude. She had been the one who left food on the neighbor's doorstep when they were sick, the one who carried extra change in her purse because she might need it for someone. He had never quite understood that about her, but tonight, standing alone in the dim kitchen, he thought that maybe, just maybe, he finally did. The next morning, he called Eleanor. "I think I want to do something," he said. "Something that matters." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I was hoping you'd say that." A week later, William stood outside a small community shelter, the early winter wind biting at his skin. The building was modest, its brick walls worn with age, but inside the windows glowed with soft light. The scent of bread and spices drifted from somewhere beyond the door, warm and inviting. He hesitated. He had spent a lifetime in control, in offices where people listened when he spoke, where his decisions mattered. Here he was, no one, just another set of hands. The thought unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. Before he could change his mind, Eleanor appeared beside him, nudging him gently. "Come on," she said. "They won't bite." Inside, the shelter was buzzing with quiet energy. Volunteers moved between tables, stacking plates, pouring coffee, serving steaming bowls of soup. People sat in small groups, some talking in hushed voices, others simply staring at their meals as if unsure whether they were real. A woman with silver-streaked hair and a flour-dusted apron greeted him. "You must be William. Eleanor told me you'd be coming." He nodded. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." She smiled, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Neither do most of us, but we figure it out." And just like that, he was handed a ladle and pointed toward a massive pot of soup. The work was simple, stirring, pouring, handing plates to strangers. But as the evening stretched on, something unexpected happened. People looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him. They spoke to him, their voices cautious at first, then warmer as the night wore on. A woman with tired eyes thanked him for the extra piece of bread. A man who looked barely older than his grandson nodded in quiet gratitude as William filled his cup with coffee. And then there was the teenage boy, silent, withdrawn, his hood pulled low over his face. He didn't say a word when William handed him a plate, but when their eyes met there was something there, a flicker of something unspoken, something William recognized. Loss. Not the kind that came with age, but the kind that came too soon, too unexpectedly. As the boy walked away, William found himself gripping the counter, his breath catching in his throat. He had spent so many years believing that his pain was unique, that his loneliness was something only he could understand. But standing here, surrounded by people carrying burdens of their own, he saw the truth. Grief was not a solitary thing. Neither was healing. That night, as he walked home, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, he felt the absence of the gloves on his hands again. But this time, it wasn't emptiness he felt. It was openness. The following week, he returned to the shelter. Then again, and again. It became part of him, part of his days, part of the rhythm of his life. The faces became familiar. The small exchanges became routine, and with each meal served, each quiet conversation shared, each moment spent in the presence of those who had lost just as much as he had, William came to understand something that Margaret had known all along, that giving was not about fixing, it was not about saving, it was about showing up, about being there, about reminding people, even in their darkest moments, that they were not invisible. And maybe, just maybe, it was also about reminding himself. Mindfulness and meditation, finding peace in the storm of old age. The early morning air was crisp as William sat on the small wooden bench in his backyard, a steaming cup of tea cradled between his hands. The garden, once Margaret's pride and joy, had grown wilder in her absence. Vines curled lazily around the wooden trellis, and golden leaves lay scattered across the grass, untouched by rakes or time. He had let nature take over, watching it change with the seasons, much like his own life had. A bird landed near his feet, tilting its head as if studying him. He exhaled slowly, watching as the steam from his cup mingled with the cool morning air. He had never paid much attention to such things before. His mind had always been elsewhere, racing ahead to the next task, the next obligation, the next thing that needed fixing. But now, in the stillness of the morning, he felt something shift, a quiet awareness, a presence he couldn't quite name. Eleanor had invited him to the temple many times, but he had always resisted. He wasn't the kind of man who sat cross-legged on a cushion, seeking enlightenment. He wasn't sure what he was seeking at all. But something about this moment, this breath, this silence, felt important. That afternoon, he finally agreed to go. The temple was smaller than he expected, nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stand watch over it. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mixing with the rich, earthy smell of old wood. Inside, the space was simple, low wooden benches, a few meditation cushions, the soft flicker of candlelight casting shadows against the walls. A monk, no younger than William himself, sat at the center of the room, his hands resting lightly on his lap, his presence steady and unshaken. William hesitated in the doorway, suddenly feeling out of place, as if he had walked into a world that did not belong to him. But Eleanor, sensing his hesitation, placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him inside. They sat in silence for a long time. At first, William's thoughts refused to settle. His mind darted from one thing to the next, the creaking of the wooden floor, the dull ache in his knees, the way the candle flames wavered as if breathing. He thought about the past, about Margaret, about the years he had spent running from one responsibility to another. He thought about the shelter, the people he had met, the boy with the hood pulled low over his face. Then he thought about nothing, not because he forced himself to, but because, for the first time in his life, he simply allowed his thoughts to come and go, like waves rolling onto the shore. He did not chase them, he did not fight them, he simply let them be. The monk finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. The mind is like a river. It moves whether we want it to or not. We can fight the current, or we can learn to float. William opened his eyes, meeting the monk's steady gaze. "I don't know how to float," he admitted. The monk smiled. "Then start by breathing." William inhaled deeply, feeling the air expand in his lungs, then exhaled, watching his breath dissolve into the space before him. He had never thought about breathing before. It was just something that happened, something automatic, unnoticed. But now, as he focused on each inhale and exhale, he realized how much he had taken for granted. For so many years he had been drowning in his own thoughts, caught in the undertow of regrets and worries. But here in this quiet temple, surrounded by nothing but breath and stillness, he felt something unfamiliar, relief. Days turned into weeks, and William returned to the temple often. He still wasn't sure what he was searching for, but he knew that when he left he felt lighter. The quiet no longer felt suffocating. The stillness no longer felt empty. One afternoon, he sat outside on the temple steps, watching the leaves drift lazily from the trees. The monk sat beside him, sipping tea from a small clay cup. "I used to hate silence," William admitted, his voice low. "I spent my whole life filling it with noise, work, plans, conversations, anything to keep me from sitting still." "The monk nodded, setting his cup down. "And now?" William watched as a single leaf detached from its branch, spiraling gently to the ground. He thought about all the things he had once clung to, all the things he had feared losing. He thought about Margaret's laughter echoing through their home, about the long nights spent staring at the empty side of the bed, waiting for something. That would never return. "I think I'm learning to listen," he said finally. The monk smiled. "Then you are already at peace." That evening, as William walked home, he felt the weight of his years differently. Not as a burden, but as something he had carried for a long time and could finally set down. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer needed to be the thing that defined him. He stepped into his house, the air inside familiar but no longer heavy. He moved to the kitchen, placing a kettle on the stove, waiting for the soft whistle of steam. As he poured himself a cup of tea, he inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth in his hands, the steady rhythm of his breath. Outside, the wind carried the last of the autumn leaves from the trees. He watched them fall, not with sadness, but with understanding. They were not disappearing. They were only making way for something new. A radiant autumn. The wind had changed. It carried a different kind of chill now, the kind that whispered of winter's quiet arrival. The trees, once ablaze with color, stood nearly bare, their branches stretched toward the sky like open hands, unafraid of what was to come. William sat on his porch, wrapped in his old wool coat, watching the last leaves drift to the ground. He no longer saw them as a loss. They were part of a cycle, falling only to make room for something new. He lifted his cup of tea, letting the steam rise against his face. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the cool evening air, comforting in its simplicity. It was strange. How much had changed, not in the world around him, but within himself. Months ago, silence had been his greatest enemy. Now he found solace in it. The empty spaces in his life were no longer voids to be feared, but places waiting to be filled. With presence, with kindness, with moments that mattered. For so long, he had resisted change, gripping the past like a man holding onto a rope fraying in his hands. He had feared what life would be without the titles, the responsibilities, the certainty of being needed. He had mistaken movement for meaning, thinking that if he just kept going, he wouldn't have to face what was slipping away. But the truth had been waiting for him in the quiet moments, the morning walks, the shared meals at the shelter, the breath he had learned to follow instead of control. He had found peace not by chasing after it, but by surrendering to it. Across the street, the lights in a neighbor's window flickered on. Inside, a family gathered for dinner, laughter spilling into the night like warm candlelight. William watched them for a moment, not with envy, but with understanding. He had lived that life once, the house full of voices, the table full of people, and now he lived a different kind of life, one that was quieter but no less meaningful. He had not been left behind by time. He had simply entered a new season. The sound of footsteps on the pavement pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Eleanor approaching, wrapped in her usual burgundy scarf, a small paper bag tucked under her arm. She lifted it with a smirk. "Fresh bread. Figured you'd appreciate something warm." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You always know what I need before I do." She sat beside him, and for a while they simply watched the sky darken, the first stars beginning to flicker through the twilight. "You seem lighter," she said after a moment. William exhaled slowly, nodding. "I think I finally stopped fighting the seasons." Eleanor smiled. "Autumn always was your favorite." He looked at the trees again, at the empty branches that no longer seemed barren but full of quiet promise. "It still is." The lesson had been there all along, woven into the very fabric of life. Everything changes. Leaves fall, rivers flow, time moves forward, whether we are ready or not. But impermanence is not something to fear. It is what gives life its depth, its meaning. To let go is not to lose. It is to make space for what comes next. For those standing at the edge of a new chapter, unsure of what remains when so much has changed, know this: peace is not found in holding on, but in learning to let go. Purpose is not something we leave behind in the past. It is something we carry forward in different forms. Say a kind word, a shared meal, the simple act of being present. These are the things that remain even as the seasons turn. William had spent a lifetime chasing after what he thought mattered. Now, he simply lived. And in doing so, he had found what he had been searching for all along. The night settled in. The sky stretched wide above him, infinite and calm. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes stirred in the breeze, their song quiet but steady, a reminder that even in stillness, life continues to move. If this story has resonated with you, if you have found a part of yourself in William's journey, take a moment to reflect, share your thoughts, your own experiences, and if you feel inclined, support this space where stories like his are told. Let's walk this path together, embracing each season for the beauty it holds.